next plot shows the assortativity, which is the correlation in the degree distribution of neighbor nodes. Assortativity is large and positive if nodes with many neighbors are preferentially connected between them, and is large and negative if nodes with many neighbors tend to be connected to nodes with few neighbors. Numerical results show that assortativity is significantly larger for kinship networks than for their random counterparts, much as clustering. The fact that assortativity is large and positive can again be understood by the presence of those family groups where nodes are connected all to all. In these groups, all sites have essentially the same number of connections, and therefore give a large contribution to the correlation in the number of neighbors. Finally, these are results for the average distance in the kinship networks. Recall that the distance between two nodes in a network is the number of node-to-node steps in the shortest path joining the two nodes. These are data for a network of 1,000 men. The error bars indicate the standard deviation of the distance over node pairs in each network. We see that the distance decreases as row grows. In all cases, distances in kinship networks are about twice those obtained for random networks with the same degree distribution. The network diameter, which is given by the maximum distance all over each network, has the same behavior. As for the dependence on the population size, average distances are systematically larger in kinship networks, but we see that they are proportional to the logarithm of n. Note that the horizontal axis is logarithmic. This is exactly the same behavior as for the randomized networks. And the same happens with the diameter. In summary, the structure of our model kinship networks combines several typical random and non-random features. First, in our model population, kinship networks formed by brothers in blood and in-law are less cohesive than expected by chance. They develop a giant component when the randomness in the children distribution is large, but this giant component is smaller than for Erdős-Renyi random networks of the same size and degree distribution. For maximal randomness in the assignment of children, the degree distribution is Poissonian, exactly the same as for Erdős-Renyi networks. The clustering of kinship networks is much higher than for their random counterparts. Their assortativity is also considerably larger, and the same happens with average distances between nodes and diameter. High clustering and assortativity can be understood by noting that kinship networks are formed by small clusters of highly interconnected nodes, which correspond to family groups of mutual blood brothers and brothers-in-law. These clusters are in turn connected between them by relatively long arrays of nodes, which explains long average distances over each network. As we have stated at the beginning, our model kinship network is the simplest we can imagine within a single generation and including both blood and in-law relations, as defined by the European kinship system. Of course, several possible extensions come immediately to mind. Higher order kinship relations, such as cousins or more distant in-law relatives, would amount to add longer range connections in the same networks. One or more marriages after divorce or partner's death would incorporate new kinship categories, such as half-siblings. Note that half-brothers and sisters have played an important role in many historical social processes. Admitting homosexual marriages would add the spouse relation as an extra kind of in-law connection in our single-gender network. Polygamy, which has been and still is very common in certain social groups, would have consequences similar to multiple marriages. Finally, the same idea used here for the relatively simple kinship system of the European tradition may be extended to other kinship systems, where one can find amazing degrees of complexity. An extension that can be immediately incorporated to the model is the effective variation in the number of marriages from one generation to the following, in particular, its decline. Having started by the middle of last century, the decline in the number of formal marriages is a widespread and sustained social phenomenon in many modern societies. Over the last 50 years, Europe has witnessed an average decay of almost 30% per generation, with a peak of 37% in Italy. In the same period, the decay in the number of formal marriages in the United States has reached about 27% per generation. And in the city of Buenos Aires, a highly dense urban environment with a relatively aged population of some 3 million people, the same number has shrunk by about 50% since the 1980s. Although the replacement of formal marriages by other forms of partnership does not completely destroy kinship, it is a fact that in-law relations mediated by informal couples are socially weaker. This gradually leads to social isolation, whose psychological effects have been associated with marriage decline ever since the decimation of the European male population in the Great War. In our model, marriage decline can be introduced at the moment of assigning children to define sibling relations, by considering a larger number of couples in the previous generation. It can be characterized by a single parameter alpha, lower than 1, given by the ratio between the number of marriages in the 2 consecutive generations. The immediate effect of this extension is to decrease the mean number of blood links in the population. And this change directly affects the connectivity in the kinship network. These plots summarize the consequences of marriage decline on the giant component of our kinship networks. The graphs to the right show the distribution of component sizes, both for kinship and for random networks. For alpha equal to 1, that is in the absence of marriage decline, we have the results that we have seen before. As alpha decreases and marriage decline becomes stronger, the peak corresponding to the giant component in the kinship network rapidly shifts to smaller sizes. The random counterpart also decreases in size, but the effect is much more moderate. For alpha equal to 0.6, which corresponds to a decay in the number of marriages of 40% between generations, the peak of the giant component is already indistinguishable from the background of smaller connected components. We can say that, below those values of alpha, the giant component is annihilated by marriage decline, and the kinship network becomes completely disaggregated in small subnetworks. In the plot to the left, we have the relative size of the giant component as a function of alpha, both in kinship networks and in their random counterpart. The shrinking of the giant component as marriage decline becomes stronger suggests that a critical phenomenon is taking place at alpha around 0.6. This critical phenomenon should not come as a surprise, as the giant component of Erdős-Renyi random networks also shows this kind of behavior when the network connectivity decreases. In kinship networks, due to their relatively low cohesion, the big difference is that the annihilation happens for larger alpha, when marriage decline has reached some 40% between generations. Alarmingly, not so far from the values in real modern populations. Following common practice in the study of complex networks, the next step will be to consider dynamical processes of social inspiration occurring on our model kinship networks. Thank you for your attention.
Okay.
If you have questions?
Any questions?
I have one.
Okay.
I have two actually. First, when you say marriage decline, you mean formal marriages, right?
Exactly.
But indeed what happens is that people maybe don't marry but still have children and then divorce and then have children with other people. And then it seems that there is another effect happening there, is that you somehow start to connect with other connections, right? Through in-law kind of relationships or now how do you call step relationships.
Exactly. In principle, the argument is that informal marriage leads to weaker relations, weaker kinship relations in the society in general, as we know in the traditional European system, the relation. But it is true that you can consider other kinds of categories in kinship coming from informal marriage.
It is clear for me that this statement is necessarily true. So, I mean, if I were in a church, I would be agreed. Let's say for the church, it's true.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's not. I can be with a woman for the rest of my life, whether or not I'm actually married.
In this kind of business, it is better not to have too much confidence in the personal experience, but one has to.
No, that's I agree. But why?
One has to hear what anthropologists say.
So anthropology says that it's weaker.
Exactly. And this is a phenomenon studied since many decades ago. As I told there, since the Great War. After the Great War, there was a decrease in the number of marriages in Europe due to the disappearance of the male population during the war. And that had an immediate effect on social connections for the women, of course, because were dead, but this is a well-known phenomenon, so it's not an invention of mine.
So do anthropologists use this kind of analysis for?
No. The typical network analysis in anthropology is limited to very small networks. So this, as it was said in one of the first slides, the so-called, well, I don't remember the exact name now, but it is what we would call the motifs of these big networks. So the structure of the networks, but at a very localized level.
So, if I understand correctly, the network of European rulers is extremely atypical.
Yes, of course. This
Totally
was only an illustration to introduce the subject. Yes, exactly.
And you almost try to maintain the total number of population as a constant level. I mean,
In the first version of the model, in fact, it is exactly preserved, the number of individuals. In the second version with the parameter alpha, what you have is that the effective population that you have, that you are considering, which is the marrying population, decreases with each generation.
Okay. Any other questions?
What is the phenotypical trait of decreasing of the kinship relationship? So what to say? So we are more depressed, we are more, so and we were happier.
Yeah, well, yes.
So this, I see
What
that
has
the structure
been
changes,
specifically
so what?
studied by anthropologists with the aid of psychologists
Yeah.
is the psychological effects of the decay in the number of marriages. In fact, and
We are happier or we are...
no, we are not happy. I'm afraid. At least the women in the last century were sadder because of you are a women of the last century, but of the second part of the century.
So the associations that would be interesting, I imagine, is, for example, whether having a particular type of topology in subnetworks would help, for example, though the average income of that group be different, or some association between that and something that is of social, economic, or other type of value, right? In a way that we can. This is very interesting mathematical set of observations, but how that is that related to some sort of selection for a particular type of relationship between
I
families?
agree with that, of course, but as was said here, in principle it is not so simple to find really statistically significant data for big populations.
Just a thought, using the new DNA relationships, right? One could try to get data, not word of mouth, but actual data to see who is related to whom and make those connections, right?
That could be.
In 23andMe or Ancestry.com kind of thing. I don't know whether that data is available for these studies, but it would be interesting to do.
My interest specifically is to, as it was said also here, to study dynamical processes on these networks, in particular flux of a flow of information, of resources, etc., etc. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Now we have the coffee break outside, and we met here in a half an hour. What?